The Hard Rock Empire is on the air. We are back with another week of podcasting excellence here on the Hard Rock Empire. I am Matt in the studio. Great to have you along with us. It is the music of July the 17th this week. We are halfway through the month of July as far as the music goes. We are, of course, into the month of August, as tonight is Monday, August the 10th. And a solid week of music once again. Not a ton of releases that made the playlist, but overall there was some good stuff on there and a couple of re-releases. We'll get to one of them on the show today, and just some good stuff overall. I thought it was a very solid week. We'll get to that, and of course we'll get to a couple of classic albums in the vault, and we'll kind of have a breakdown early in the show of what the first half plus of the year has looked like on the Hard Rock Empire. Joining me in studio, as always, is Mike. Mike, how's it going?
It's going. Started looking at the numbers now that we're kind of through the first half of the year into July as far as what the music we're listening to. It's funny because it's kind of an opportunity for me to go back and kind of reminisce on what I've picked earlier in the year and kind of what stands out to me as far as what could be my top albums of the year. So that's kind of cool stuff I need to go back and revisit. But always kind of cool to look at the numbers.
For sure, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we start today's show. And one thing that you pointed out off the air that is worth kind of pointing out as we talk about this is, at some point we made the shift to just picking one album every week instead of two. So the overall mass of albums, the volume of albums has gone down, which kind of makes the distribution of albums maybe more interesting because there is still a balance, despite the fact that we are just picking one album every week. There's still a lot of countries that have been represented throughout the first little over half of the year, maybe 28 weeks or so, so just past the halfway point. But I guess as we get into those numbers, starting with the country breakdown, what really jumps out at you?
I don't know if any one thing jumps out at me because I kind of feel like it's a continuation of what we've seen in the past. Obviously, as far as countries go, United States is going to have a pretty healthy chunk of the pie, just being that's where we're from. Sweden obviously always comes in strong. We talked a while back about kind of the thriving metal scene in Italy, so not surprising to see it well represented. And, nothing really that I wouldn't expect, I suppose.
Let me run down the total number for each country, and then we can talk further about, as Mike mentioned, the U.S. coming in at top of the list with 10 albums so far this year. That accounts for just under 18% of the albums chosen. Sweden right behind with 9. That is just over 16% of the albums chosen. And rounding out the top 5 is Norway in third with 5 albums, and then a tie for fourth with Italy, Germany, and France with 4 each. Finland with 3, the UK with 2, Switzerland with 2, Spain with 2, Canada with 2, Australia with 2. A combo Sweden-Canada gets 1. I guess maybe each country gets a half of
we could do that, yeah.
half of an album. And then rounding out the rest of the list, all of these countries have 1 album each: Puerto Rico, Greece, Brazil, Belgium, Austria, and Argentina, to round out the 56 total albums we've chosen so far this year. And again, not surprised to see the countries we see at the top of the list, but I think, as has been the case really since we started this podcast, the number of countries that we've chosen at least one album from is a pretty impressive group. Nobody can really accuse us of honing in on 4 or 5 countries and basically ignoring the rest of the world. We are trying to just pick whatever's the best that week, and wherever they come from, that's what ends up on the list.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you look at it from like a function of the population, you could make the argument that countries like Sweden and Norway and Italy are probably overrepresented compared to some of these other countries. But yeah, I mean, clearly metal's being made worldwide. And honestly, even though the United States has the most, there are times it feels like there's more metal elsewhere than in the United States. And that's a thing. But still, it's worldwide.
Well, the reality of the way the numbers work is, we mentioned the U.S. is at the top of the list, and that's 10 albums and 17.86%. That means a little over 82% of the time we're picking an album from somewhere else.
For sure.
So I would say maybe the U.S. in some regards is underrated. I think it would be interesting to. I don't know that you could find a legitimate statistic to say like how many metal bands there are in each country in the world, and then basically cross-pollinate the list to show like what countries, if you did a true, the U.S. has this many metal bands and Sweden has this many metal bands, like how close are our percentages of what we pick to what the overall metal population is, I guess. I think you could do probably overall population pretty easily. Those numbers certainly a lot easier to come by, but like you said, probably some, if you go by strictly population of the country, yeah, I would say those countries are overrepresented, Sweden, Norway, Italy. But if you go by the amount of metal acts we see coming out of those countries every week on the playlist, you can almost make an argument that it's either right on the money or in some cases maybe even a little underrepresented, because Italy in the past has been maybe a little bit heavier. It hasn't been quite as much this year. It feels like we've gotten fewer releases from Frontiers that have made the list, even though we're going to talk about the fact that we did have picked 8 of them so far this year. It feels like they've been more spread out this year. So, it's interesting that that's kind of how it's worked out from a country standpoint.
Well, and the other thing, too, that I think would be worth looking into, but way more difficult because you're starting to talk about genre, is what you're seeing out of each country.
Yeah.
Because I think when you look at Sweden at having 9.5 albums so far this year, that probably skews very heavy to the melodic rock AOR side of things, where you're probably not seeing that as much in the United States.
Yeah.
If I were to guess, I would say the United States is probably more traditional metal. I feel like a lot of that's being made now in the States. Probably some alternative metal, stuff like that. You have your Norways in Finland's where you might see more like melodic death or something like that. It would be interesting to see what the exports are for each country and what kind of dominates the scene.
Yeah, I would guess, because that would be the other question, obviously, is breaking it up by genre if you could, just because there's a lot of gray area in genre.
You'd have to come to some sort of consensus on what is the one definitive genre for each band, even if they kind
cross multiple genres. The other thing, obviously, would be to break it down into your picks and my picks, because obviously, I would guess my picks have skewed more European, and your picks have probably skewed more American, but there have been crossovers where I've picked American bands and you've picked European bands, just because of what you just said. I think the melodic, the AOR, that's probably more European centric, whereas the U.S. is probably just more hard rock. But I'd be curious to see like how that all breaks down. But moving on to labels, it's interesting to me out of the 56. Again, Frontiers is tied for the top, which is not really a surprise. Self is what it's tied with. The fact that we have 8 of the albums out of the 56 that are self-released. And, I guess the reality is at the beginning of the podcast, I would have thought that number would have been higher because it is more doable to basically self-release an album. But I also did not realize that all of these record labels exist, because there are so many record labels that have at least one release. It's just a ton. And again, not surprised with Pride and Joy coming in right behind. We're going to talk about them again today, as also in addition Sweden. But there are a ton of record labels that have at least one album that we've chosen so far this year.
Yeah, it's really encouraging to see. And if you go back and look at the stats from prior years, I mean, there are way more record labels than you can imagine of varying sizes and areas of focus. It's encouraging because, again, last year, and I don't know if these are the final statistics, but we were up to like 31 self-produced albums in 2025. So, yeah, it happens a lot. But you look at something like Wormhole Death, and I know like a lot of instances with them, they'll pick up a band and re-release the album that they had self-released a year or two ago and find success that way. But yeah, it's great to see that there are still, I mean, I assume a lot of these are probably indie level labels, but labels nonetheless, anything to kind of give you that partner in crime in terms of promoting your album, that's never a bad thing.
And you said 32 self-released albums last year?
That was the last total, 31 from last year. So I need to go back and make sure that's updated.
So if that's accurate, we're pretty much on pace for that, because, again, we're picking half as many albums, and we're halfway through the year.
Yeah.
So 8 that's kind of on par for that. And it'll be interesting to see, because that's something we really haven't seen yet on the podcast, is something that we pick that's self-released, and then one of these labels picks them up and ends up releasing them under the label somewhere down the road, and they show up again on our list, because that could certainly happen. But it's encouraging. There's a lot more music being made out there. We talk about that all the time. This podcast has revealed that there's so much music out there, and so much of what you like, whatever it is you like. Because again, this is only reflective. And honestly, that's maybe the other thing that's noteworthy is this list in general has been trimmed up, not just because we have chosen one album each, but also because we're picking from a smaller subset as you kind of narrowed down the music to what we listen to. If you made a list of all of the record labels that would show up on those lists last year, it would be hundreds of record labels. So no matter what you like, it's being made out there by somebody. It could be a band that you like that you didn't realize was still making music, or it could be somebody new who was inspired by something you like and is now out there basically giving that type of music its own, their own twist. But it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I was recommended a video on YouTube that I watched yesterday, and it kind of made me think about how we go about discovering artists now, and how artists are discovered just in general, because it was a video talking about how so many of the pop acts nowadays, they sell this story that, they really grinded it out and came from nothing. But then when you look behind the scenes, you'll find that, the father was in the music industry and this person has a connection here. It was talking about how, I think they said Sabrina Carpenter, her aunt is the voice actress for Bart Simpson.
Yeah.
It's all these, Taylor Swift, her dad is some big wig, Merrill Lynch guy or something like that. So so many of these people, they sell them this, they sell you the story that they really, had to grind it out to become something. But a lot of them kind of started on third base. And I think for rock and metal, it's harder to come in to have that same circumstance because people aren't looking to elevate you.
Well, I mean, it happens outside of the music world as well. I mean, in the tennis world, Jessica Pegula, her dad owns the Buffalo Bills. It's you definitely have a case where they have all the built-in advantages. Now, I will say that, because that comes up a lot in the broadcasting industry, obviously in Cincinnati, the Brenneman family, I think Tom Brenneman probably got some opportunities.
Oh, sure.
Because his dad was a legend, and he certainly earned his opportunities. Obviously, he had some missteps along the way, but seems to be kind of working his way back through that. And his son is now at Indiana, and he's, working his way through the broadcast field as well. And, the thing I've always said, especially in broadcasting, and it's not true everywhere, sometimes people will just get pulled into the spotlight because of all their connections. But I do think a lot of times it'll get you in the door, but you do have to have something there, some sort of substance that keeps you in the door. It's going to open door. And that's the thing, is a lot of these people that we talk about every week, they didn't have that person to let them in the door. And if they've gotten in the door, they've busted their way in, or they've gone in through the window, or they're still looking for that entrance in the door. They may be something that we look at their YouTube, music, and they've got 10 plays on their album.
I think for heavy music, there aren't that many doors.
Yeah.
Even if you had connections, people aren't looking to sign and really promote metal at that level.
Well, we've seen it even in, just kind of rock music in the 90s and 2000s. You had, bands who had the sons of legendary musicians who, would have one hit or two hits or maybe an album, and then you didn't really hear from them again. And it's they definitely had the door open for them, and they still didn't hang around, or at least didn't, their hits didn't. They might still be making music and very happy. But yeah, with heavy metal, with melodic metal, stuff that's not necessarily mainstream popular, the road is a lot harder. And the fact that there are people out there doing it and doing it with success is a testament to, just the perseverance and talent that, if you do have the talent and you do have the people behind you that can lift you up, you can still find a way in this industry. Even, maybe it's not to the main stage at Wacken, but if it's to if you get the chance to play music for a living or to some level, that's, I think, pretty awesome.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's don't let anyone else tell you what music you should enjoy.
Yeah.
Go out and find it yourself. You know what you like. It's being made, whether it's metal, whether it's bluegrass, whether it's, you know, techno, country, acoustic, whatever. Like, it may not play on satellite radio. It may not be going viral, but it's being made.
Yeah, I would say, web search is your friend. Bandcamp is a great website, especially for smaller bands.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff out there. And honestly, doing what we do, I mean, I know it's work to go through the new releases every week, but because so much of this stuff ends up on streaming sites, you can test drive all this stuff before you ever decide to buy something. And then, you can, once you decide, hey, this is pretty cool, I like it, then you find the Bandcamp page and you find out they've got 5 albums they've released and some of them are on vinyl, and then it just snowballs from there. But a lot of good stuff out there, and certainly encourage people to do a little research. And again, our podcast is here for that reason as well, both in the stuff that we actually pick and play on the podcast, but also for the stuff that ends up in Mike's playlist that we don't necessarily pick. Is a good chance to maybe open the door. And that's why every week I tell you, like, when you go into the YouTube page for this episode, there will be a link to Mike's playlist. I encourage you to go through and listen to it and then find the album that it goes with and check it out. A lot of good stuff for sure, but interesting stats. I'm always a big stats guy. So any chance we get to just break it down. And again, small sample sizes, don't always necessarily show a trend, but, you can get some ideas of kind of what it looks like just based on even the 56 albums we've picked so far this year. So pretty interesting stuff. Of course, check out our website, nerdcastempire.com. We'll be back again next Monday night for another episode of the Hard Rock Empire. It'll be the music of July the 24th coming up next week. So be sure to join us next Monday night. Overall, I'm, hoping that we continue to see the number of albums continue to increase. We kind of had a dip around the 4th of July, but seems like maybe a few more this week and hopefully a few more even as we go through to next week. But it is time to get to the new music for this week. As I mentioned, Mike's playlist, probably sometime around now, you will see that show up in the top of this video in a card that will pop up. You'll also see it down at the bottom of the comments. There'll be a link to go to the playlist. Encourage you to do that. Just find what's out there. Give it a listen because, again, there's a lot of stuff and we can't talk about it all. We can't play it all on the podcast, but we can at least give you the access to take a look at it. So definitely check that out. Of course, before we get to the stuff we actually picked this week, Mike has a list of big name acts that have released stuff, re-releases, interesting names, just a bit of a hodgepodge of things about this playlist that maybe otherwise would slide under the radar. So before we get to the stuff we're going to talk about, Mike, what else do we have this week on the playlist?
Yeah, so as far as kind of the bands I would consider to be major acts and what they've released this week, we did have the newest from Motionless in White, the album Decades. It's their 7th studio album. Obviously, the Scranton, Pennsylvania-based metalcore band, certainly popular. We got the 6th studio album from the Canadian band Protest the Hero, a progressive metal band releasing their newest album Within. And also a covers album from the band Tesla. They released Homage. Interesting list of covers, to say the least, on that one. The one that really jumped out at me was the CCR cover. I thought that was really well done.
Yeah.
Other notable stuff, there weren't really any box sets to talk about, but a couple things I did listen to that I enjoyed. The second album from the band Nova Rain, California-based progressive power metal band. Album Shifting the Axis of the World. Some longer compositions on that one, but still really, really cool and worth checking out. And then also the 5th album from the Illinois progressive metal band Black Sites, that album For Eternity, also really cool.
Yeah, it's funny, the Tesla album made me go down the wormhole, and one of the covers that I really enjoyed on there was the cover of the Climax Blues Band song, I Love You. Just an underrated type song, but I would have bet anything. And of course, one of my vault gimmicks is one-hit wonders. And I was like, well, we're probably going to come up on that song here soon because I thought it was released in the early 80s. And I was right, except they're not a one-hit wonder. They had another hit back in 1976 with Couldn't Get It Right. So here's a band that I was sure was a one-hit wonder that was at least a 2-hit wonder. But I thought it was funny because I found the single for Couldn't Get It Right, and the B-side in most countries was Fat Maybelline. But in the U.S., they went with Savory Gravy, and that is, I think it's pronounced Savory. It's S-A-V with a hyphen.
Yeah, it's got
R-Y. Savory Gravy. I would like to hear both of those songs to see what in the world's going on there, but just one of those little, detours that you get when you're going through this music every week. Do want to note that another album I listened to that I really enjoyed was the German power metal band Stormhammer with Wrath of the Hammer. Enjoyed that. They had a really good sound. That would have been a very solid pick as well this week. So
wanted to get to that one, just didn't get around to it, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely recommend that one. I thought, because again, sometimes with that type of power metal, it gets a little bit too over the top. I don't think they ever did. I thought it was a really good sound. So definitely a bonus pick for this week. But, of course, there can only be 2 albums that we choose for this podcast, and you certainly have a very interesting pick for your selection this week. So what do you have for your pick?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I love going through the music each week is every now and then you just stumble into something that you're like, I can't believe someone made this. I'm glad they did, but I had no idea someone was out creating music like this. That being said, this is the debut album from an Italian instrumental progressive metal project. The project is called Ray Code Zero, and the album is Chronicles.
Yeah, you told me about this. I listened to the track on the playlist, and this is probably exactly what I thought it was going to be after you told me about it. But again, great to see this type of music being made. As we said, there's about every type of music you'd want to hear being made, and I would not have necessarily bet on something like this showing up on the playlist, but certainly glad it did.
Yeah, when I started listening to the track that I pulled for the playlist, I then went to Wormhole Death's website, which is the label that signed this project, and reading kind of the bio talking about that the guy that created this, his influences include Dream Theater, Children of Bodom, and the legendary video game music composer Nobuo Uematsu. I knew it was going to be right up my alley. Maybe not for everyone, but definitely something I was going to enjoy. The person involved, the project itself was started by Lorenzo Vizentine. He wrote the album back in 2023, but kind of first conceived the concept back in 2017 after having spent 4 years in a Final Fantasy music tribute band, which not surprising when you listen to this.
Not at all.
The name Ray Code Zero was chosen to evoke both a video game title and computing project. So, I mean, there could be a lot more going on with this. We'll see in the future. Also performing on the album, you have Stefano Zamberlini on guitars and Manuel Trabucco on saxophone. They mentioned too on the website that this was created with live performances in mind. So I don't know if at some point they're going to tour with this, but I think it would make a really cool show. There's an article on breathingthecore.com going over kind of the inspirations for each track, and it's really fascinating. Obviously, the Uematsu influence is pretty evident. It feels like Final Fantasy music in a lot of ways. But, they also evoke Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Joe Satriani, Crash Bandicoot, the video game. Like, it's all over the place. Track 10, Goodbye Satoru, is dedicated to his late friend, keyboardist Samuel Orlando, with whom he played in the Final Fantasy tribute band years ago. He also mentions Uematsu's The Black Mages Project, which is basically like Metallica's Symphony and Metallica, only it's Final Fantasy and metal. It's a really cool thing. They have like 3 different albums covering Final Fantasy tracks. Definitely something worth checking out. But yeah, like I mentioned, this may not be for everyone, but if you like video game music, if you like progressive rock and metal, it's so cool and definitely something that you can just cruise to or have playing in the background while you work. Just really cool stuff. I can't really pick standout tracks. If you like one of them, you're going to enjoy the entire album. The track I did pick to play feels like it could be like a metal cover of a Final Fantasy VI boss battle song. The track that I did pick is Unleash Your Power.
Check these guys out. It's Ray Code Zero with the album Chronicles. This is the 3rd track off of that album, Unleash Your Power. Let's listen to a little bit of that now. Always hard to find a spot to cut out of an instrumental song. As there's no chorus.
Like, there's the end of the chorus. Let's move on.
Yeah, again, exactly what I thought it would be. You mentioned the Final Fantasy stuff. There have been numerous tours here in the U.S. I believe Uematsu's been involved in several of them where they have taken the music of Final Fantasy and put it to an orchestra or had a traveling band go to big cities, mostly, occasionally anime conventions to be able to put this on. So I could see where people that would be involved in that project might be inspired to try to do their own thing, kind of parallel to that music. It's a game that obviously the people who love it love everything about it, but generally the music is something that is beloved even beyond the hardcore fans of the game. So not a surprise to see a project like this come up. Will be interesting to see kind of where it goes from here, whether it does become a tour, whether there are more offshoots of it to, take advantage of kind of what they're looking to do. But overall, again, I think if you're a fan of video game music in general and specifically Final Fantasy type music, I think you'll certainly find something here to like.
It's kind of a weird full circle moment because, when you look up information about Uematsu, like you find that he was heavily influenced by a lot of progressive rock and metal of that period. You think of like the Blue Dragon soundtrack that he did the music for, where they brought in Ian Gillan to sing on the boss battle music, which was just like this really weird combination of metal and video games. It's just, now you have new people out there who want to make metal, but want to tie it back to Nobuo Uematsu. It's just really cool stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely check that out. Ray Code Zero with their album out on July the 17th. As I mentioned earlier, we are headed back to Sweden for my pick. We are also headed to Pride and Joy, who continue to be a force on our podcast. And this is a case of the album or the label picking up this band and re-releasing a classic album from them. But it was a good enough album and one that by and large was hard to find in print at this point and was really sought after. So a smart move to put this back out there again. The band is Code Red and the album is Incendiary. They're a Swedish AOR melodic rock band. This is the band's only album release. It was originally released in 2017 via the label AOR Heaven. It's become a genre classic of the 2010s and has since become a sought-after rarity. The album includes the 10 original tracks. Also will include 3 bonus tracks. The physical release was limited to just 300 copies. So my guess is that means it's probably already sold out. We'll see if there are additional pressings, if it does really well. But interesting for sure. The band is made up of Ulrich Lundqvist on lead and backing vocals and acoustic guitar, Morgan Jensen on electric guitars, Oscar Bromval on lead guitars, Michael Pallas on lead and backing vocals and guitar solo on Heat of the Night, Casper Dahlquist on keyboards, and Daniel Flores on drums. From the Metal Temple Review, it mentions this is an AOR melodic rock album of the highest quality. No wonder it's regarded as a classic. The bonus tracks are superb. The album is worth just purchasing just for those bonus tracks. It's an instant classic, and he suspects that there will be additional pressings because it will be so popular. Always interesting and great to see classic albums get re-released, especially ones that are very hard to come by. Of course, a lot of these albums still live in the streaming sphere, but people really do want that physical copy in 2026, which of course is great to see. And the fact that this is going to get back out there is certainly good. And it flies by, 59 minutes. Compared to my vault pick, which dragged on sometimes at 75 minutes. This really went by quickly. Pride and Joy's done some great work. They're quickly rising among our favorite labels on this podcast. I think there's a little more of an edge to a lot of this, which I think will make metal fans who maybe aren't always into the melodic side of metal a little happier. Vocals are great. The harmonies are great. The guitars really stand out. Overall, it's just really, really well done. Honestly, it's one of the better AOR albums I've heard in 2026. No wonder they wanted to rescue it and re-release it. And I hope it's with them getting picked up by this label. I don't know, where these guys stand at the moment, but I would love to see something new from them if they're still actively making music, because it would be awesome to get a chance to see what something new from these guys would sound like in 2026. But if you're an AOR fan, melodic rock fan, this comes with the highest recommendation. Standout tracks include I Won't Be Your Hero, My Hollywood Ending, Into the Fire, and the song we're going to listen to on the podcast is Heat of the Night. Let's check these guys out. It's Code Red with Incendiary, the re-release. This is the second track off of that album, Heat of the Night. Let's listen to a little bit of that now. Kind of out there in the middle of the guitar solo. Yeah, it's interesting. You have a band that had one album and it clearly was well thought of, and you have Pride and Joy kind of come swooping in and bring this back to the forefront. And I think we've seen this quite a bit over the time of our podcast, where these albums are getting rescued and re-released and put back in physical form. So again, hopefully these guys will do something new, but really cool to get a chance to catch up on an album that certainly I would have missed the first time it came out in 2017. But Mike, your thoughts on Code Red?
Yeah, when I pulled the track for the playlist, my thought was like, man, this can't be bad. Like, this playlist song is tremendous, and not surprised to find out that the whole album is solid. So yeah, I'm curious to see. Both, like, is this band going to continue and create more music, and then also what's the next kind of, back catalog license release from a label like Pride and Joy.
Yeah, great stuff from them, great stuff from the band. Excited to see where they go next, but definitely worth checking out Code Red. Their re-release out on July the 17th. That takes care of the new music, or so to speak, new music this week. It's time to get into the vault, where Mike and I will each talk about a classic album you need to check out. Mike is continuing on through the years, and he has really found some interesting albums. These are albums that, either were important albums for the band, or just big standout albums, or just ones that Mike wanted to check out as he goes through the list. And this is one that, honestly, a band that I only know for one or two songs, but I'm kind of curious to see what some of their other stuff sounds like. We're up to 1981, and definitely curious to see what you have picked for this week's edition of The Vault.
Yeah, it's interesting because while over the years I have kind of tried to focus on like the biggest album from that band that I'm just not familiar with, every now and then you reach the point where you pick an album where it's kind of the downward trajectory of the band, maybe not quality-wise, but just infighting in the band, or just, shifts in their musical direction that could lead to negative things. And that's kind of what I have here, even though kind of looking back on it now, this is kind of considered one of the big influential albums of the era. 1981 is a ridiculous year. There are so many big albums, so many big debuts. Just from the debut side of things, we have Weird Al Yankovic releasing another one, Rides the Bus EP. Duran Duran with their self-titled, with Girls on Film, Planet Earth. Motley Crue released Too Fast for Love. Bad Religion released their first EP. And Venom, Welcome to Hell, came out. Those guys being pioneers in extreme metal, so a lot of the stuff that I may or may not add to the playlist each week has been indirectly or directly influenced by them, so that's a big deal. As far as the big albums go from established acts, you got Styx releasing Paradise Theater, kind of the last album before the wheels kind of came off for them. Rush released Moving Pictures. Iron Maiden released Killers, the last album with Paul Di'Anno. Rick Springfield released Working Class Dog with Jesse's Girl, I've Done Everything for You. Van Halen released Fair Warning. Blue Oyster Cult released Fire of Unknown Origin. Of course, that had Burnin' for You on it, which is an amazing song. Foreigner released their album 4. Journey, as we've talked about in the past, released Escape. The band Saxon released Denim and Leather, great album. Triumph released Allied Forces. Michael Schenker Group released MSG, which is a great album that I certainly recommend as well. Black Sabbath released Mob Rules, and Kiss released Music from the Elder. So a lot of bands and interesting points in their career in 1981. What I ended up going with, though, is an album that I was familiar with. I own it already, but really just haven't given it the time it deserved. So thankfully this week I was able to listen to it numerous times, and man, it's an amazing album. That album in question is the 9th studio album from the English rock band Electric Light Orchestra. That album is called Time.
Yeah, they're a band, again, I really need to get more into their catalog. When I went through the years, I picked Triumph's Allied Forces, which was great. We, of course, as you mentioned, also have talked about Journey from 1981 as well with Escape. Rick Springfield, I know we're not to go too far off the beaten path, but one of the more underrated musicians, I think. He came along at an interesting time because you, in your brain, you associate him with like the mid to late 80s time frame. But in 1981, that's kind of a time where maybe more popular pop rock hadn't really come about. Maybe he doesn't necessarily get the credit he deserves for some of the stuff he did in his career.
Yeah, that was one I wasn't expecting to see. And I think that's another one of the interesting things about going through the years is that your memories of when certain maybe different genre of rock acts, when they were around, is just really disjointed. So much of the 80s pop rock stuff I just assumed came out in 1986 and forward, not the front half of the 80s. So
yeah, for sure.
That was kind of weird. And also kind of wild thing, Bad Religion, because to me it's like I didn't really get into Bad Religion until early 2000s. I knew they'd been around forever, but even then it's like I think the first album of theirs I've listened to, as far as chronologically speaking, is probably Recipe for Hate.
Yeah.
So, there's a whole decade of their music, including one album that evidently you can't find because they just kind of erased it from existence. It was their third album, counting the EP as their first. It was basically like more prog influence. Like they had keyboards and stuff. Yeah, like
that's wild.
Yeah, I'm always kind of curious about that one, but yeah, so many big albums. The ELO album, though, Time, like you, they're a band that I just really was never introduced to over the years. I knew Don't Bring Me Down from 1979's Discovery, which is funny because I was watching a video kind of going over their history, and one of the members of the band always referred to that album as Disco Very because it was them. It was the first album at this point, 1979. It was the first album where basically they decided to not use their kind of trio of orchestral players and instead shift more into what was big at the time, disco. The album Time would kind of continue that, where they shifted more into synth rock and some of their other influences, and it was kind of just the band slowly eroding away. But as far as this album itself, I wasn't aware of it at all until a video game cover band, the Megas, released a cover of Yours Truly 2095, which clued me into this album. And after checking it out the first time, I also found out that there was this big Japanese sci-fi convention for years, dating back to the 60s, called the Nihon SF Taikai. But in 1983, the show was called Daikon 4, and this group put together this animated opening for it, which actually included the song from ELO, Twilight, second track on the album. But I checked that out, and it was really amazing, and the people who did that animation ultimately went on to form Gynax, so kind of a cool historical thing there. This album does feature Jeff Lynne, who is kind of the front runner, band leader of the group, a guy whose music history I was not familiar with really either. I had no idea that he was one of the Traveling Wilburys until today. Just no idea, but sure enough, that's a thing. Bev Bavon on drums and percussion, Richard Tandy on acoustic and electric pianos, synthesizers, vocoder, and guitar, and Kelly Graucut on bass guitar and backing vocals. Like I mentioned, this is the second album of theirs that did not feature the trio of Mick Kaminsky, Hugh McDonald, and Melvin Gale. And while the 1979 album Discovery was more a disco album, this one explored kind of elements of 1950s rock, new wave, reggae, rockabilly, and the Beatles. So music's all over the place on this one. I can kind of see why people might have been a little disillusioned because this is just a further cry from their hits that they had in the 70s. I'm just kind of surprised when you listen to some of the tracks on this album that these guys never really made it big on MTV. From what I gathered, Jeff Lynne wasn't really a big fame-seeking individual, and they really didn't have that visual image that maybe translated to MTV as well. But kind of a shame when this album had a lot of great tracks, and you think of some of the early MTV songs, and you think, man, this stuff's way better than Video Killed the Radio Star. But yeah, you go through the album, and you got synth pop tracks like Twilight, Yours Truly, 2095, and Here Is the News. Tracks that feel very Beatles-esque, like Ticket to the Moon, Rain is Falling, and 21st Century Man. You have the reggae-inspired The Lights Go Down, and then Hold On Tight, which is like a rockabilly track. So it's really interesting and does not get boring. The album itself is a concept album about a man who seems to have entered the year 2095, although it's never really made clear if this really happens to the character or if it's a dream. They don't really ever resolve that. He meets a female robot. He reflects on the 80s. He walks down a street that he is familiar with, but he can't recognize it anymore. He tries to contact his girlfriend from the past, but can't. When asked about it, Jeff Lynne even states that he doesn't have an answer as to whether the main character really time traveled or is just dreaming the events of the album. I found his answer kind of funny. There's a quote on Wikipedia about it. It's like, when asked whether the man's experience had been a dream all along, Lynne responded, "This is what I'd like to know, because it's baffled me since I wrote it. And if he has actually gone to the future, or if he's just thinking about it, it could be real, it could be a dream. I'm not sure. I'd rather not say, because I don't know either. I'm supposed to, but I don't."
Drugs are an amazing thing.
Yeah, and that was kind of my thought, was just like, poor dude got sober, and he's like, what was I even writing about? I have no idea. But yeah, I mean, he's immensely talented, and this album is just fantastic. Standout tracks on it include Twilight, Yours Truly, 2095, The Way Life's Meant to Be, The Lights Go Down, 21st Century Man, Hold On Tight. It's a wild album. I think everyone should definitely give it a listen.
Just completely going off the rails because I have not had the chance to listen to it yet. But you mentioned Daikon 3 and Daikon 4, which are referenced here. I didn't know what Daikon was, but the most notable reference to it came in the anime Fooly Cooly, where the main character, Haruko, comes flying in on a robot and screaming Daikon 5. And basically come to find out that is, I guess, not quite a shot-for-shot remake of Daikon 3 and Daikon 4, but basically there are similarities in that scene that pay homage to those.
That's amazing, because I wasn't even aware of that back then when I watched Fully Coolly.
No idea. And, of course, should have been, to some degree, when you put the pieces together, because, of course, Fully Coolly is a Gynax show.
Yeah.
So, this was all kind of tying all those things together, and probably another reason why Fully Coolly may be the greatest anime of all time, despite the fact it's only 6 episodes, because there's just so much stuff going on in there and so many intertwining things and references that, honestly, something like this makes me want to go back and watch it again, because so many years later, there may be things that I didn't get the first time that now, like this,
Gynax in general was a tremendous company.
Yeah.
Apparently they weren't very good at running a business.
No.
but as far as the works that they put out, I mean, they legendary.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, just a little off the beaten path on that one. So yeah, interesting stuff. I definitely need to check that out. ELO.
And look at Jeff Lynne's discography, who he worked with. 'Cause, I mean, he basically did production work for all the members of the Wilburys on top of being one of them. Just dude's been super prolific. They basically said that because he had such a grand vision for what ELO was supposed to be, it just made him the obvious choice to then go into production roles for all these major stars.
It makes sense. I mean, you want somebody who's got big visions and big ideas, and clearly he did. So
he was a big fan of what the Beatles became over time, evidently, and that was kind of his thought for ELO. The Beatles have broken up in 1970 or whatever. He kind of wanted Electric Light Orchestra to be that thing to carry on that legacy.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But, again, a band that just never really was exposed to outside of their hits, and I think I probably need to go back and give them a more thorough listen, but I encourage you to do so as well. Mike's Vault pick, which is Time from 1981. I am continuing through the Journey albums, and now we're getting to the actual interesting part of this, as we are now just about to the end of the Steve Perry era. In fact, we're going to wrap that up this week as we get to the vault. We're going to fast forward 10 years into the future from the last time we talked about an album that was raised on radio from 1986, and now we are jumping ahead to the reunion, if you will, 1996's Trial by Fire, which, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, was the first Journey album I owned, buying it probably not too long after its release. Take a look at the tier list where we are right now, and you can see that we're going to probably be filling the middle and bottom part of this list over the next few weeks, if I had to guess. But that is kind of where things stand right now through the albums that I've reviewed so far. So we'll drop that off. Again, Trial by Fire, the 10th studio album by Journey, released on October 22nd, 1996. Marked the reunion of the classic 1981 to 1985 lineup, which had not recorded together since 1983's Frontiers. Was the first album to feature bassist Ross Valerie and drummer Steve Smith since Frontiers, and the last to feature Smith and vocalist Steve Perry. Included a top 20 hit and Grammy-nominated single When You Love a Woman, which reached number 12 and number 1, respectively, on the Billboard Hot 100 and Adult Contemporary charts. Message of Love, Can't Tame the Lion, and If He Should Break Your Heart were released as singles and received radio airplay. Trial by Fire is the only Journey album not to be accompanied by a supporting tour. That was due to internal disputes over a tour. Perry was set to get a hip surgery. He wasn't sure about getting it. The band basically gave him an ultimatum and said, you either get the surgery or get replaced, and he left.
Something got replaced, and it wasn't the hip.
It was not the hip. I mean, maybe eventually, but certainly not in time. Drummer Steve Smith also quit, citing that the band without Perry did not interest him. He would subsequently return in 2015, but would be dismissed again from the band in 2020. The album entered the charts at number 3 on the Billboard 200 and was eventually certified platinum in the United States by the RIAA. Band did not receive another platinum award until Revelation in 2008. Of course, as many of you may know that are fans of the band, they went off and did their other things during that 10-year hiatus. Neil Schon and Jonathan Cain formed Bad English, released albums in 1989 and 1991. If you don't know Bad English, you should definitely check their stuff out. Steve Perry released his second solo album, For the Love of Strange Medicine, in 1994. It was during that tour of that album that he basically kind of got the feeling that he wanted to do more stuff with Journey. So he got Cain and Sean back together, and they started writing. And boy, did they ever write. It was noted on Wikipedia, which was funny to mention. Greg Rowley was invited and quickly uninvited, according to him. Of course, he left the band in 1980, so there would be no reunion with Rowley, which really is a shame. Would have been cool to see what he would have brought to this album. AllMusic gave it 1.5 stars out of 5. The review kind of sums it up pretty well. It says, after a 10-year hiatus, Journey returned with Trial by Fire, an album that sounds as if no time had passed between it and the band's last album, Raised on Radio. Journey had been completely unaffected by any trend in popular music, whether it's hair metal, hip-hop, or alternative rock, and frankly, they're better for it. Trial by Fire delivers exactly what any Journey fan wants. If you've enjoyed Journey in the past, you're certain to enjoy the best moments of Trial by Fire, but if their arena rock and radio-ready ballads have never agreed with you, this album will not change your mind. The user reviews on AllMusic were very much mixed, some calling it a half-hearted effort, others excited to get more of what they liked. I will say this, and obviously this was the first time I have listened to this album in its entirety in probably more than 20 years. This album's way too long. Way too long. If this album had been 10 tracks and 45 minutes, I think it would have been more highly regarded, probably. There's just too much filler on this album. It checks in at 16 tracks and 75 minutes. I could certainly see why they would have had so much stuff, because it had been 10 years since they recorded together. But maybe all of it didn't need to go on this first album. Maybe we could have planned a second album. I don't know if that was them kind of realizing that maybe this reunion was going to be short-lived and they just wanted to cram it all on there, or like we've talked about before, a lot of albums in this era, bands felt like they had to give their fans their money's worth by just putting so many tracks on these albums, and in reality, it kind of weakens the overall quality of the album. The hits are good. In fact, I would say they're strong and could go alongside their hits of the 80s. Then there's about 4 or 5 other tracks that are pretty solid, and the rest generally is skippable. I enjoyed the hits and still listen to them to this day, but I don't think I would buy this album again if I had the option to do so. The standout tracks include Message of Love, When You Love a Woman, If He Should Break Your Heart, Still She Cries, When I Think of You, Easy to Fall, Trial by Fire. On the list, it's going to drop in at the bottom of great hits, but not quite the best. The third category, probably will listen to the hits on greatest hits only, because I'm not sitting through 75 minutes of that again. So it's a greatest hits. It's just above the prog albums, but honestly, if it wasn't for the big hits, it might not be. But again, the band was going to be short-lived in this form because Steve Perry was going to exit and Steve Algieri was going to come in. And starting in 2 weeks, we're going to get to the Steve Algieri era with their 2000 release Arrival. I remember really enjoying Algieri's singing, and obviously we're going to talk about in 2 weeks that he's been involved in a lot of different rock projects over the last 25 or 30 years. So there's a good chance you've heard his voice somewhere. But I'm definitely curious to see where the sound goes from here, because from here on, I've not listened to any of these albums. I may have heard a track or two here and there, but this is all going to be new territory for me, so I'm really curious to see where these rank going forward. But I do wonder, and I'm sure the band does too, if things would have turned out differently if they're able to go on this tour and everybody gets along and they just kind of continue forward as Journey. Are they going to get to the mega status they were in the 1980s? Of course not, because that music just wasn't popular. But could they have continued to release big albums and occasionally have some songs pop up in the top 10? Yeah, I think so. But that wasn't what happened. And going forward, starting in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about kind of the rest of the story, if you will, for Journey. But again, it was great to hear the band together. Unfortunately, it was going to be very short-lived.
Yeah, it's funny. And I think kind of how I feel about Journey is the same way I feel about so many other bands who I didn't become a fan of until after their prime. So, you look at Journey or like any like hair band that I was into when they started releasing albums again in like the late 90s, I was excited because I finally got to have something that's current, that's of this band. And my mindset was I wanted it to sound like the old stuff.
Yep.
I don't know the industry probably didn't care, but I think most fans, they've lived through different fads of music, and you find out your favorite band from the 70s and 80s is releasing an album, you at least want it to feel like it's their album again. Yeah. Like not, well, this is them, but it's them doing grunge.
Yeah.
Like you don't want a Journey grunge album.
No.
The other kind of interesting thing is you talk about the length of the album. I did a quick search, and this is only the Google AI overview response, but I searched average album length by year. There was a Reddit post that unfortunately got deleted that evidently someone had compiled that data. Wow. But the AI overview mentions that when you look at like the vinyl era, like 60s to 80s, the average album length was 35 to 42 minutes. Then they have the CD era, the 90s and 2000s. That jumped to 50 to 74 minutes. And you had, the CD can hold up to 80 minutes of music. So let's fill it up. Let's if we're going to charge premium for these CDs, this is kind of pre and early stage of streaming era or download era. We got to justify the price for these things.
Yeah.
Now, according to this, the streaming era, 2010s to present, average album length is back down to 38 to 45 minutes. And I think we've seen enough to say that's certainly the case. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I remember in that CD era of music, albums were just comically long.
Yeah. And I get it because fans were very, I think the average fan probably who collected vinyl could tell you how much music you could put on a vinyl. but people were acutely aware of how much music you could put on a CD because everybody was burning their own CDs.
Once people started burning CDs, it was no secret.
Like, how many songs you can get on there. So there was probably a feeling that, if they know we can get 80 minutes of music on here and we give them 60 minutes of music, they're going to be mad that they were cheated out of 20 minutes. So I can't really blame them for that, and I'm sure it was the label that had some input on that as well. But
they were charging the same price, whether the album was 35 minutes or 70 minutes.
Yeah.
So.
It's like now, though, in the download era, because that's when I'm revisiting this album, it just seems comical. It's like 75 minutes of this, and some of those songs are so forgettable. It's like I couldn't have told you about anything about some of those songs, and I listened to them this afternoon. It's just, I get why they did it, but when you start comparing what this album looks like compared to some of their classic albums, it hurts it because there's 10 tracks that are like, this makes a pretty good album. And there's 6 tracks like, you kind of just threw these on here. And yeah, it's great to hear Steve Perry sing, but I've already listened to 10 songs of him singing. I don't need another 6 songs of him singing. So, and I don't know, in hindsight, should they have thrown a couple covers on there? Should they have had another member of the band sing a song, because they're going to do that later on in albums where they have different band members singing lead on songs. Could you have done something different that's okay, maybe that song's still forgettable, but it's so different than everything else on the album that you kind of forgive the fact they've stuck it on there.
Yeah. I think, again, when you're talking about this is our first CD in over 10 years, do a cover song. Do something kind of out there to get people excited. Why not?
Well, now you think of all the bands they would have toured with over the years. You would have to think there's a couple of them where they could have just called them and said, hey, we're going to cover this song by REO Speedwagon or, this song, by, or even maybe some of their influences, or even cover something from their 70s albums that are prog and, have
Give it
Steve
a modernized
Perry.
version of it, essentially.
How wild would that have been?
That could have been really cool. And to your point earlier about if it had worked out with Steve Perry at that point in time and they had gone on tour, I mean, how many years has Styx and REO Speedwagon been touring from 2000 on? I mean, even if Journey wasn't filling stadiums at that point in time, clearly these 70s arena rock acts were doing pretty well on the road for the past 20 years.
Yeah, there was certainly money to be made there. And of course, again, Journey did continue to tour, and they're going to tour with a couple of different lead singers over the next 20 plus years as we look forward into their history. But you do wonder, if some of those tours are with Steve Perry up front instead of Steve Algieri or Jeff Scott Soto or Arnel Pineda, who we're going to talk about in a few weeks, how many more tickets do you sell?
Yeah.
Do you go from playing the Taft Theater to playing, the Great American Ballpark?
The sad reality is that the lead singer is the most important piece.
It is.
It's what it is. They're the front facing part of the act. They're the one thing where it's two guitarists can potentially play all the same parts. It doesn't matter. I need the voice.
Yeah. And it's just, that's the face of it. I mean, it's the voice, but it's also the face of the band. And, we have seen and have talked about multiple times bands who have replaced their lead singer. Queensryche is one that obviously we have spent a lot of time talking about.
Yeah.
And it's to some degree worked for them because they found somebody that can sound like Jeff Tate from 1988. And, Jeff Tate's continuing to do his own thing to varying degrees of success. But there's those decisions to be made. And we won't get too deep into it because we're wrapping up the podcast. But it is one of those things that bands have to kind of figure out, what do they want to do going forward? Do they just keep touring with their lineup? Can everybody get along? Can you have a reunion before it's too late? Or do you mix it up and do something new, and then you hope your fans want to hear songs like they sounded like instead of what they might sound like in 2026? It's not an easy choice, and every band's got to figure out what makes sense for them.
And the reception's going to be different based on the circumstances. Your original lead singer dies, you replace them. Can't really complain about that.
No.
If that lead singer is taking the band in a direction that you're not a fan of and is maybe doing some erratic things and they fire him and replace them, you won't get as much blowback as something like Steve Perry, where I don't think the average person had any idea why he wasn't still with the band.
Yeah, in reality, as we talked about earlier today, at least as I remembered it, I thought he had some sort of vocal issues, but it turned out it was a hip surgery. It kind of makes me change how I feel about it. But
Sure.
again, as I also said today, how much of it was a true hip surgery thing, how much of it was they were having some conflicts and they let this become an issue because you feel like if everybody's getting along, maybe you let it go. But I also remember from, I think, Behind the Music, who were talking about, the other members of the band are like, hey, we were together for the first time in 10 years and we want to get out and tour this album. And here's our lead singer who maybe for whatever reason isn't as excited to get out there and do it or whatever it may be.
Feels almost like a Styx situation.
Yeah, where it's like there were definitely different visions of what was going to happen there. And again, it's worked out for Styx to some degree.
Yeah.
And we'll never know how it would have worked out for Journey had they stuck together. Could have been very similar path. Maybe they don't release any more albums. Who knows? But we're going to talk about the next album they're going to release in a couple of weeks. So we'll see what the Steve Augeri era sounds like in Journey coming up in 2 weeks' time. That is going to wrap things up for this edition of the Hard Rock Empire. Thank you so much for joining us once again. We'll be back again next Monday night for another episode talking about the music of July the 24th next week as we get closer to the end of the month of July. So be sure to join us again next Monday night, 7 o'clock Eastern on our YouTube page. Big thanks to Mike, as always, for his hard work on the podcast. Big thanks to Stoveleg Media for their continued support, and a big thanks to you whenever, wherever you're checking out our podcast. We definitely appreciate it. We appreciate, of course, all of the comments, likes, shares on social media. And, of course, join the Discord. You'll see the link in the comments below. We'd love to have you there to build our community out there. That's going to wrap things up for this week's edition. Until next time, for the entire crew, I'm Matt saying so long. Don't forget to join the Empire, the Hard Rock Empire.